Have you ever wondered about the Fall of Gondolin? One of Tolkien's very first stories and the last book published by his son Christopher Tolkien? Well, that's what we're here to talk about today. Welcome back to the Librarian of the Rings. My name is Ben, I'm the Librarian, and today we're going to be doing a review of the Fall of Gondolin. Now, I've already reviewed the whole box set that this copy of the Fall of Gondolin comes from, which includes the Tale of Beren and Luthien, and also the Children of Húrin. So make sure you check that out to learn more about the box set if you want to know about it. But this time we're going to review the Fall of Gondolin. Now, there will be a few spoilers in this, but this book is pretty much spoiled anyway. It's by the Silmarillion and Unfinished Tales because most of what's in here has already been published in those books. So there's not a whole lot to be spoiled here if you've read anything else in the Legendarium. So let's get right to it. What is the Fall of Gondolin? Well, this is the story of the elvish city of Gondolin, which is the last hidden kingdom during the First Age of Middle-earth. Now remember, the Lord of the Rings takes place during the Third Age of Middle-earth. So this is taking place thousands and thousands of years before that. If you remember in the Lord of the Rings movies, in the prologue, the Battle of the Last Alliance, that takes place at the end of this Second Age. So even way before that. So if you're coming from the Lord of the Rings, there aren't going to be a lot of characters that you're familiar with in the Fall of Gondolin. There really aren't any, except for a few names that you might recognize from being thrown around when they're talking about the tales of ancient days. So there's going to be some new stuff to get used to. But this story is absolutely fantastic. It's probably one of my absolute favorite stories in the entire Legendarium. I think it was one of Tolkien's too. It's one of the very, very first things that he writes when he is out of World War I due to his health problems. And he continues to work on it throughout his life. Tragically, he never finishes it. And Christopher, his son, actually talks about that in this book, how of all of the manuscripts that his father left unfinished, this one makes him the most sad because he really would love to have a fully finished ending to it. So because of that, this book takes kind of an interesting form. Tolkien wrote several versions of it throughout his life, or different drafts, or different summaries of it, depending on what he was doing. Unlike the Children of Húrin, which again is in the same box set as the Fall of Gondolin, this doesn't take one continuous narrative flow to it. It actually presents different versions or drafts or summaries of it, mostly in chronological order to how J.R.R. Tolkien wrote them. And then it provides commentary from Christopher Tolkien on kind of the evolution of the story as it went along. So Tolkien did write a complete version of this story very early on. One of the very first things that he wrote, it was really a complete version from beginning to end. The problem is it didn't just like mesh directly into the rest of the Legendarium just because of a few things, like the main character in this story, Tuor, his ancestry changes during several of the versions in order to connect him in with other stories that are going on in the First Age. So there are some changes, and so that full story couldn't just be taken in. That story also was pretty much a draft. It didn't have a lot of the detail. The very last version has lots of detail, but it never gets to the ending. It takes Tuor from his birth all the way up until he reaches Gondolin, but it never gets to him actually entering Gondolin. So of course it never gets to the Fall of Gondolin. You just need to know that coming into this book, that it's not going to read exactly like a novel. It's going to read like different drafts of a story, and then you can kind of take what you want from each of those different drafts. In each version, it really is a wonderful story. Now, if you compare this to the Children of Húrin, which is the most tragic story that Tolkien ever wrote, this one is a pretty happy story, but it's called the Fall of Gondolin, so it's actually pretty tragic too. Just compared to the Children of Húrin, it's not nearly as tragic, and it doesn't have a tragic character. Where Tuorin is a really tragic hero, Tuor is not. Tuor is a much more sympathetic hero. He's someone that I think you can relate to a lot better. And he does what he's supposed to do, and he helps the Valar, and because of him, there is hope. This story does end tragically, but the hope of Tuor's son, Eärendil, is born. And Christopher, because there wasn't enough material to do a whole book on Eärendil, inserts that story into here as well. Now, there is not new information in this book. Everything here was published someplace else before it came in, and then each of those versions was then compiled into this book so that it would all be in one place. And I really like that. I really appreciate having it all there. Now, like I said, what's really interesting and kind of poetic about this is that it's one of the very first things that Tolkien writes that is then later incorporated into the broader Legendarium. This also happens to be the last thing that Christopher Tolkien writes. And he thought Beren and Luthien, which I haven't reviewed yet, but I will soon, was going to be his last book. It wasn't. He still had one book left in him, and it was The Fall of Gondolin. And I just think that that is such a beautiful thing for him to be able to do as his last thing, the first thing that his father did. And I really appreciate Christopher Tolkien's dedication right up until the very end of his life to bring us as much of his father's work as possible. We would have such a small sliver of information about Middle-earth and Tolkien's works if Christopher had not dedicated his entire life to doing it. So I always like to just pay my respects to Christopher Tolkien whenever we talk about one of these books that he has put together for us. Now let's talk a little bit about the audio version of this. I also listened to it, and the audio version is a really fantastic version. And the reason I think it's really great, and this is also done in Beren and Luthien, is that it's done by a father-son team. So Timothy West, the father, and Samuel West, the son, do the readings of it. You have Samuel West, the son, reading the parts that J.R.R. Tolkien actually wrote, which of course he started writing when he was younger. So you have him reading that, and then you have Samuel West, the father, reading the parts that Christopher Tolkien wrote, which of course he wrote when he was older, at the very end of his life, in his 90s. And so you have this really kind of nice auditory cue of which of the Tolkiens you're listening to at any given time, and it just helps to kind of flow with the way the book is written. So that's a really interesting part of this book, and one that I personally really enjoyed. Now on the hard copy, you are of course going to get the beautiful illustrations of Alan Lee. So you just have that remarkable work that's done by Alan Lee. And so having the hard copy for those pictures and images is really valuable as well, if you don't want to just listen to it and you want to be able to see some of the visuals or read through some of it, because some of it will make more sense when you can read it on the page, looking at it. Okay, so what's my recommendation here? I really think this is a great book. It tells one of my absolute favorite stories from the Legendarium of Middle-earth, and so I would recommend that you get it. Now, like I said, all of the portions that are in this book were published other places, and so if you are already happy with the story of the Fall of Gondolin that you have in the Silmarillion or in Unfinished Tales, then you may not necessarily need this book, but I think it provides a broader view of the whole thing. And the last portion of this book in particular, the really detailed account that Tolkien was working on at the end of his life, is a really marvelous story. On the flip side of that, it will make you very sad when you get to the end and realize that it doesn't continue past the gates of Gondolin, and so you never get that highly detailed version of the later story where most of the actual drama is taking place. And I really wish that we had that, but I'm glad we at least have this. And I would recommend this to any Tolkien fan who's looking to go beyond kind of the basic works of The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, and The Silmarillion. Okay, that's going to do it for this review of The Fall of Gondolin. If you have any questions about it, please drop those in the comments below. Also, if you've already read it, let me know what you think of it. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, farewell wherever you fare. May your ears receive you at your journey's end.